Yesterday evening, Iran tried to pull off a surprise missile attack on American forces. Every single missile got shot down. Then, less than 24 hours later, the President of the United States used language so profane that Fox News had to bleep part of it on air, and by 8 o'clock that same night, American forces were hitting Iran directly. I'm going to walk you through exactly what's confirmed here, hour by hour, because this specific sequence, from a failed surprise attack to a presidential threat to actual strikes, all happened inside about 24 hours. And it's still unfolding as I'm recording this. Let's build the timeline in order because the sequence itself tells the whole story. At 5:45 in the evening Eastern Time on July the 28th, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran, aiming at American forces based in the Middle East, in what CENTCOM directly called an attempted surprise attack. According to a detailed daily tracking log of this war, the IRGC specifically targeted a U.S. airbase and a central command center in Jordan. Every single missile was intercepted. CENTCOM's own statement confirmed it. All Iranian missiles were successfully intercepted. U.S. forces remained vigilant and at a high state of readiness. Jordan's own news agency separately reported 5 interceptions over the kingdom in the early hours of that same night. Here's a detail worth sitting with because the timing wasn't random. This attempted surprise attack came just hours after President Trump had concluded a White House meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Whether that meeting itself provoked the timing of Iran's attack, or whether it was simply coincidental, isn't something any source has confirmed directly, but the sequence, a high-profile meeting between the American and Israeli leaders, followed within hours by an attempted Iranian strike, is exactly the kind of pattern that deserves to be noticed rather than treated as unrelated. Iran didn't stay quiet about its own intentions either. The IRGC put out a statement making its position completely explicit. As long as threats against the Islamic Republic of Iran continue, and illegal and vicious actions by American forces against our interests continue, the resistance will continue. That's not an apology for a failed attack. That's a direct declaration that more attempts should be expected. The response came fast, and it came from more than just the United States. On July 28th, American and Saudi fighter aircraft struck Iran-backed militia sites across 7 separate Iraqi provinces, killing at least 20 fighters and wounding 32, according to the same detailed tracking log. CENTCOM's own statement specified the targets directly, multiple terrorist logistics and weapon sites across eastern Iraq, describing it as a strong response to more than 30 IRGC-directed aerial drone attacks in the preceding 72 hours alone. Here's the detail that makes this particular strike historically significant on its own. This marked the first joint U.S.-Saudi strikes in Iraq of this entire war. 2 countries striking together for the first time in this specific way, in this specific conflict. Saudi Arabia's own defense ministry confirmed its direct involvement, stating the strikes were carried out in coordination with CENTCOM, while adding that the kingdom does not seek escalation, but will respond to any aggression it faces. That's a notably careful, measured statement from a country that had spent much of this war trying to avoid exactly this kind of direct, publicly acknowledged military action. And it broke from that caution specifically because, according to Riyadh's own account, drones launched from Iraq by Iran-affiliated militias had attempted to target petroleum facilities inside Saudi Arabia itself. The Iran-backed side of that fight didn't stay silent either. The Iran-aligned Popular Mobilization Forces, an alliance of dozens of mainly Shia armed factions in Iraq, said in a statement that at least 20 of its own members had been killed and 32 wounded in the strikes, separately calling it a highly dangerous escalation and a violation of Iraq's sovereignty. Iraq's own prime minister reportedly directed the country's foreign ministry to pursue legal action against both the United States and Saudi Arabia over strikes that killed or injured dozens on Iraqi soil, according to CNN's own live coverage of that day. Now here's where Trump's own language enters the story. And it's worth quoting precisely, because the wording itself became part of the news. Speaking to Fox News, Trump said, quote, "We'll be hitting them hard. They're going to get a beating." That's the version cleaned up for broadcast. NBC News reported the fuller, uncensored version of what he actually said, that the United States would, in his exact words, beat the bleeping bleep out of them, language raw enough that Fox's own chief foreign correspondent, Trey Yingst, was the one who first reported it, coming directly from the president in that call. Trump didn't stop there either. Standing in the Oval Office the next day, he told reporters directly, "It's our turn to strike Iran," adding, "In the meantime, we're going to be hitting them very hard because it's our turn to hit them. They know it's coming." When a reporter specifically asked whether he would always respond to an Iranian strike, Trump answered simply, "Pretty much." He also referenced the intercepted missiles directly, saying 5 rockets were shot going 8,500 miles an hour and all 5 rockets were knocked down to the ground, but they nevertheless took a shot. And then it happened. CENTCOM confirmed that U.S. forces began launching strikes against Iran at 8 p. Hempstead Eastern Time on July 29th, describing the operation directly as a powerful response to yesterday's attempted Iranian attacks on U.S. forces based in the Middle East. CNN's own live coverage reported explosions heard that night in several locations across southern Iran as the strikes got underway. This is confirmed, on the record, by CENTCOM's own public statement, not a leak, not an anonymous source, the exact same kind of direct military confirmation that's backed nearly every major strike throughout this entire war. Let's talk about the economic ripple effect because it hit within hours and reached markets far beyond the Middle East. Brent crude, the global oil benchmark, jumped over 7% to $90.66 a barrel, specifically in reaction to Trump's promise of retaliation against Iran's attempted attack. By the next day, according to the same detailed daily tracking log, Brent had pulled back somewhat but still rebounded more than 4% toward $88 a barrel. That kind of single-day volatility, driven directly by a presidential threat rather than an actual completed strike, tells you how tightly wound global energy markets have become around every single escalation in this specific war. There's a maritime dimension unfolding in exactly this same window too. Iran rejected a proposal from Oman for joint management of the Strait of Hormuz, and the IRGC said it struck 3 tankers in the waterway during this same stretch, according to Iran's own semi-official Tasnim news agency, which maintains close ties to the Revolutionary Guard. Separately, the shipping industry has been actively exploring alternative routes, including through the Suez Canal, to move oil out of the region entirely, after Iran-backed Houthi forces separately declared that Saudi ships trying to reach the Indian Ocean would become targets too. Transits through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait have already fallen 22% since that declaration. Here's a detail that deserves careful, honest treatment, because it's exactly the kind of claim that requires scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance from either side. Iran's acting Minister of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics, Brigadier General Majid Ebn-al-Reza, told the semi-official Tasnim news agency that Iran's defense industry production lines are, in his words, more active than ever, and separately claimed that strikes on strategic defense facilities had failed to halt Iranian weapons production entirely. CNN was direct about the limits of that claim, stating plainly that neither Ibn al-Reza's claims about Iran's current production capacity nor the full extent of damage caused by U.S. and Israeli strikes could be independently verified. That's the honest position to hold here, an unverified claim from a government spokesperson tied to the same organization actively fighting this war, not a confirmed fact. This connects directly to a genuinely uncomfortable moment that already happened in front of Congress, and it deserves real attention. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had previously stated that Iran's military had been destroyed and rendered combat ineffective. At a Senate hearing just last week, lawmakers directly questioned him about that exact assertion, and Hegseth declined to say directly whether that earlier assessment was actually accurate. Think about what that moment represents: a sitting defense secretary, under direct questioning from elected senators, unwilling to stand behind his own prior public claim about how thoroughly Iran's military had actually been degraded. That's not a partisan talking point. That's a documented exchange in an official congressional hearing. And it tells you plainly that even inside the American government, there's genuine uncertainty about how much this war has actually accomplished strategically. It's worth remembering that this exact kind of overstated early assessment, followed by walked-back caution, isn't unique to this war. Militaries and administrations throughout history have sometimes described early strikes in maximalist terms, specifically for public morale and deterrence value, only to face harder questions later once the actual messier battlefield reality becomes clearer over time. That pattern doesn't make Hegseth's original claim dishonest, necessarily, but it does mean his unwillingness to reaffirm it under direct questioning deserves to be weighed seriously by anyone trying to assess how much actual progress this war has made. There's supporting context for that uncertainty too, and it's worth including because it strengthens the case for skepticism on both sides of this specific dispute. CNN reported back in May that Iran was rebuilding its damaged military-industrial base faster than expected. That's an independent assessment, reported months before this latest round of strikes, suggesting the pattern of Iran absorbing damage and then reconstituting capability faster than American planners anticipated isn't a new development. It's been documented as an ongoing trend for months. Let's talk about the human cost, because it's easy to lose sight of real people inside a story built around missile interceptions and oil price percentages. The U.S. launched this latest round of strikes after 4 American soldiers were killed in Jordan and Iraq in recent days, according to CBS News' own ongoing coverage. One of them has been named directly, Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton, 30 years old, from North Carolina. Secretary of State Marco Rubio specifically clarified the circumstances of his death, saying Swinton was decommissioning ammunition when an accident happened. That's an important distinction to make, honestly. Not every American death in this war has come from direct enemy fire, and conflating an accidental death during ammunition decommissioning with a combat casualty would misrepresent exactly what happened to this specific soldier and his family. Beyond that, almost 100 American service members have been injured in strikes on Middle East bases just this month alone, according to U.S. officials cited by CBS News. The financial cost of this entire war deserves its own honest accounting, too, because the numbers involved are staggering. Defense Secretary Hegseth told lawmakers directly that the Iran war has cost $37.5 billion. But CBS News' own sources indicated the total cost could be far higher than that official figure, in part because of military construction needed to repair American bases that have already been damaged throughout this conflict. Separately, the White House has requested $87.6 billion in supplemental funding from Congress, some of which is earmarked specifically for stockpile replacements and troop deployments within CENTCOM's own theater of operations. A retired Jordanian general speaking to CBS News added another layer of concern, saying directly that Iran is developing techniques and capacities to target U.S. forces with increasing lethality over time, not decreasing. Here's a political development that deserves far more attention than it's gotten, because it represents a genuine break within the president's own party. The House of Representatives voted to direct President Trump to end the war with Iran, and that vote passed specifically because 4 Republicans joined Democrats to rebuke the president over his handling of the conflict. That's not a symbolic protest vote from the opposition party alone. That's members of the president's own party formally breaking ranks on the war itself. A real documented signal that political support for continuing this conflict indefinitely isn't unanimous, even among Trump's own allies in Congress. There's a supply chain problem sitting underneath all of this too, and it's worth naming because it affects how sustainable this entire campaign actually is going forward. According to CBS News' ongoing coverage, America's defense industrial base isn't equipped to produce missiles rapidly enough to replenish the munitions being used in this war, or to keep pace with what's being transferred to Central Command for its own operations. That's a structural manufacturing capacity problem, not a battlefield issue, and it means the pace of this entire campaign is genuinely constrained by how fast American factories can build replacement weapons, regardless of how much political will exists in Washington to keep striking Iran. That constraint matters enormously for understanding what happens next, because even if political appetite in Washington existed to escalate this war dramatically further, the physical capacity to sustain that escalation with American-made munitions may not currently exist at the pace such an escalation would require, a limiting factor that has nothing to do with strategy or political will and everything to do with factory output. Let's put this latest round of strikes inside the broader pattern this war has followed for months, because it helps you understand just how routine and simultaneously how serious this specific kind of exchange has become. CENTCOM's own public releases document a consistent rhythm of these strikes throughout July alone. A round on July 8th specifically aimed at degrading Iran's ability to attack commercial shipping. Another round on July 12th that hit roughly 170 targets across 2 consecutive nights. Another completed at 9 p. Amsterdam Eastern on July the 20th, and a Saturday round before this most recent escalation that hit roughly 140 Iranian military targets, including missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations. This latest strike, beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern on July 29th, is the newest entry in that exact same recurring pattern, not an isolated, unprecedented event. It helps to place this entire 24-hour sequence inside the fuller arc of the war, because none of this happened in isolation. This conflict began on February 28, 2026, when President Trump announced what he called major combat operations against Iran, with massive joint U.S.-Israeli strikes hitting military, government, and infrastructure sites across the country. That opening campaign eventually led to delegations from both countries entering negotiations in June, aimed at a war-ending deal built around a signed memorandum of understanding. But according to ABC News' own live tracking of this war, the U.S. and Iran have nonetheless continued to exchange strikes ever since that memorandum was signed, with the Strait of Hormuz remaining the primary flashpoint the entire time. That's the essential context for everything that happened this week. This isn't a war that restarted after a clean pause. It's a war that's been grinding on continuously through a supposedly binding peace framework for months. Let's go back to that Netanyahu meeting for a moment, because the timing deserves more scrutiny than a passing mention. Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, and Iran's attempted surprise attack came just hours after that meeting concluded. Wars involving multiple allied nations often see exactly this kind of pattern, a high-level meeting between 2 governments coordinating military and diplomatic strategy, followed by a hostile response from the country those 2 governments are jointly pressuring. Whether Iran's intelligence services were specifically responding to something discussed or announced during that meeting isn't something any source has directly confirmed. But the pattern itself, an attempted attack landing within hours of a Trump-Netanyahu meeting, is consistent with how Iran has responded to other high-profile U.S.-Israel coordination throughout this entire war. There's a reason Saudi Arabia's direct, publicly acknowledged participation in these July 28th strikes matters so much more than it might first appear, and it's worth spending real time on. Throughout most of this war, Saudi Arabia had deliberately avoided this kind of open, declared military action, according to reporting stretching back months, instead reportedly carrying out its own quieter, less publicized strikes against Iranian-linked targets, while maintaining public distance from the broader American-led campaign. That changed specifically because Iran-affiliated militias in Iraq had, according to Saudi Arabia's own defense ministry, attempted to target petroleum facilities inside the kingdom directly, with drones launched from Iraqi territory. When your own oil infrastructure becomes the direct target, the calculus around staying publicly uninvolved changes considerably, and that's exactly the shift that produced the first openly joint U.S.-Saudi strikes of this entire conflict. It's worth understanding the broader pattern behind those popular mobilization forces specifically, because they're not a single unified group. They're an alliance of dozens of mainly Shia armed factions across Iraq, many of them aligned with Iran's broader regional strategy. CENTCOM's own statement provided crucial context for why these specific groups were targeted, noting that from February through April of 2026 alone, there had been more than 600 attempted attacks on U.S. citizens and facilities by Iran-aligned militias in Iraq. 600 attempted attacks in roughly 2 months tells you this wasn't a new or isolated problem that suddenly erupted this week. It's been a sustained, high-frequency threat running throughout nearly this entire war, with the July 28th strikes representing an escalation in the American and Saudi response to that pattern rather than a response to a single new provocation. The Iraqi government's own position adds a genuinely complicated legal and diplomatic wrinkle to this entire episode. Iraq's prime minister directing the foreign ministry to pursue legal action against both the United States and Saudi Arabia represents an Iraqi government caught in an impossible position, hosting American military infrastructure and cooperating with Washington on one hand, while watching foreign airstrikes kill and wound dozens of people on its own sovereign territory on the other. That's not a simple story of allies acting in perfect coordination. It's a messier reality where even a country broadly aligned with American interests in the region is compelled to formally object when strikes conducted partly in its own defense still end up killing people within its own borders. I want to walk through exactly where the confirmed line sits across this entire sequence, because that's the whole reason to cover a story moving this fast, this carefully. Confirmed through CENTCOM's own public statement, Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles at U.S. forces in Jordan at 5:45 p.m. Eastern on July 28th, and every single one was intercepted. Confirmed through CENTCOM and Saudi Arabia's own defense ministry, American and Saudi aircraft conducted joint strikes across 7 Iraqi provinces that same day, the first such joint action of this entire war, killing at least 20 and wounding 32. Confirmed through Trump's own quoted words to Fox News and NBC's separate reporting on the fuller, uncensored version, the president promised a forceful, explicitly profane response before any retaliatory strike had even happened. Confirmed through CENTCOM's own statement, U.S. strikes on Iran itself began at 8 p.m. Eastern on July the 29th. Confirmed through Secretary Rubio's own clarification, one of the 4 recently killed American soldiers, Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton, died in an accidental ammunition decommissioning incident, not direct combat. Confirmed through the House's own recorded vote, a bipartisan majority including 4 Republicans formally directed Trump to end the war, and explicitly unverified, flagged honestly by CNN's own reporting. Iran's own claims about its current weapons production capacity and the true extent of damage from months of U.S. and Israeli strikes. It's worth putting real numbers behind just how much oil and shipping activity actually runs through this specific corridor, because it explains why a single presidential threat before any strike even happened could move global oil prices by 7% in one day. The Strait of Hormuz has traditionally carried roughly a fifth of the world's entire seaborne oil trade and 20% of its liquefied natural gas. Every time this specific conflict escalates, even rhetorically, traders across the entire world reassess the risk to that flow of energy almost instantly, which is exactly why Brent crude's jump to over $90 a barrel happened before a single American bomb had actually landed on Iranian soil this week. The market was pricing in Trump's words themselves, not yet the actual military outcome. There's a broader signal worth drawing from this specific choice to strike Iraqi militia sites jointly with Saudi Arabia rather than hitting Iran directly in that first wave of retaliation on July 28th. Militias operating inside Iraq represent a lower risk, more contained target than direct strikes on Iranian soil, allowing the US and Saudi Arabia to demonstrate a forceful response to the drone attacks on Saudi petroleum facilities, without immediately escalating toward a direct exchange with Iran itself. That measured sequencing hit the proxy forces first, reserved the direct strike on Iran for a clearly separate, distinctly announced operation the following night, suggests a deliberate escalation ladder being managed carefully rather than a chaotic, indiscriminate response to Iran's failed missile attack. It's worth naming the diplomatic angle sitting underneath Iran's rejection of Oman's mediation proposal too, because it shows the diplomatic track hasn't fully closed even during this exact week of active strikes. Oman has served as a key mediator between the United States and Iran at multiple points throughout this war, and its specific proposal for joint management of the Strait of Hormuz represented a genuine attempt at a structural long-term solution to the exact dispute driving so much of this conflict: who controls passage through the world's most important oil choke point. Iran's rejection of that specific proposal, arriving in the same general window as its failed missile attack and the retaliatory strikes that followed, suggests Tehran currently sees more strategic value in direct confrontation than in the kind of negotiated framework Oman was offering, at least for the moment. Let's talk about what analysts and retired officials are actually saying about where this specific pattern leads, because that context helps you judge how seriously to take this latest escalation compared to the many others that have already happened throughout this war. The retired Jordanian general's warning to CBS News that Iran is developing techniques and capacities to target U.S. forces with increasing lethality is a genuinely different kind of assessment than simply noting another round of strikes happened. It's a claim about trajectory, that Iran isn't just repeating the same tactics that have already been intercepted successfully so far. It's actively working to make future attacks harder to stop. Whether that assessment proves accurate is something only future attacks, hopefully none of which succeed, will actually be able to confirm. Before wrapping up, I want to name every source this script draws on, because a story unfolding this quickly across this many countries deserves complete transparency about where each piece comes from. CNN's live, near-hourly coverage of the July 28th and 29th events, including Trump's direct Oval Office quotes and the confirmed strikes on southern Iran. CNBC's detailed reporting on Trump's promised beating and the confirmed interception of all Iranian missiles. NBC News reporting on the fuller, uncensored version of Trump's comments to Fox News. ABC News' live coverage confirming the Jordan missile interceptions and the broader war's background since February 28th. CBS News' ongoing coverage of the war's financial cost, the 4 recent American casualties, including Sergeant Swinton, the nearly 100 troops injured this month, and the House vote directing Trump to end the war. A detailed daily war tracking log that provided the specific timeline, target counts, and oil price figures across this entire sequence. Wikipedia's actively sourced page on Iranian strikes against Saudi Arabia, providing broader cumulative casualty context. And CENTCOM's own official public releases, which remain the original source for nearly every specific strike date, target count, and objective named throughout this entire war. So here's the complete, honest picture of what's actually happened in the last 24 hours. Iran tried a surprise missile attack that completely failed, every missile intercepted. The United States and Saudi Arabia responded with their first joint strikes of the entire war, hitting militia targets across 7 Iraqi provinces. The President of the United States promised a response in language raw enough that networks had to censor it. And then American forces actually struck Iran directly the same night, confirmed by CENTCOM's own statement. Underneath all of that, a defense secretary who won't stand behind his own earlier claims about Iran's military being destroyed, a House of Representatives that just told the president to end this war, and a war whose true cost may be considerably higher than the $37.5 billion currently being cited. That's not a single dramatic headline. That's an entire war compressed into one 24-hour window, and every piece of it is confirmed, named, and dated. If you want the next update the moment there's real movement here, whether that's further strikes, an actual return to negotiations, or more fallout from that House vote, subscribe and turn on notifications, because I'm tracking this exactly the way I just laid it out for you. Sourced, quoted directly, and honest about which claims are confirmed versus which ones are still just one side's assertion. And down in the comments, tell me directly, do you think Hegseth's refusal to defend his own destroyed and combat ineffective claim under oath changes how seriously you take official statements about this war going forward? Or do you think that's just standard political caution under pressure? I read every one of these, and it genuinely shapes what gets covered next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.